background.
Yeah, your background. Yeah, it's okay. No worries. Yeah, that's why the rehearsal time is important. Let's make that a consistent SOP, right? At least half an hour, 45 minutes before we must do a trial run. Okay, and after that we can then reconnect 15 minutes before, making sure everything is good. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So all of you are muted. Very good. So there's no way that right. So just let us know when we can start, Vic. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're coming in from. A warm welcome from sunny Malaysia, right? As I look out through the window, I can see the sun shining in. Fantastic day ahead, right? Welcome to the Tech Talk Asia, right? This is our third session, all right? Very excited to come to you live, right? And of course, in this third session, we have some exciting content in store for you, right? Just like all the previous two sessions, this session, we're going to focus on the Azure PaaS services, which currently runs on Azure Stack HCI 22H2, right? Azure Kubernetes Service and Azure Virtual Desktop, right? And of course, one of the most exciting recent announcement was also AKS Lite, right? Meaning AKS running in a single node, right? Which is something that many customers who are doing edge deployment have been looking forward to. Now, to jump straight into the content, we actually have 5 key areas built up for you, starting with some latest announcements, all right? Obviously, a little bit of content from Jeff Woozy that has trickled in from the recent Windows Server Summit. And of course, the latest, greatest news on GPU partitioning, GPU-P for short. But not forgetting that all of these are built on top of Azure HCI 22H2. So we want to elaborate a little bit more on that. And of course, the recent release of Windows Admin Center 2211, all right, with our OEM partners like Dell EMC, HP, and Lenovo with their respective extensions that give us depth in terms of management, all right, from the hardware all the way into the solutions down into the cloud with Azure. And of course, after that, we are going to go in and elaborate a bit more on the advanced multi-layer security. And of course, soon enough, you soon understand why we keep talking about security, security, security. And of course, the last but not least, we also wanted to show you the scalability capability, going from a single node to 2 node and beyond. Not just limited to a scale-out scenario, the scaling up scenario is equally powerful with Azure HCI. So that's where powerful resiliency gives us the reliability that our customers can depend on. So let's get started quickly, all right? So to get us going this week, all right, we are going to cover Burst, Persist, Transform. We're going to cover Windows Subsystem for Linux version 2. We're going to cover Containers 101. We're also going to look at AKS, and we're going to look at hybrid VDI with Azure Virtual Desktop, and of course, even hybrid management. So let's think a little bit about why we're doing this, all right? And I've shared this with our communities for the longest time. Our dream, all right, our passion is to inspire you. And hopefully through that inspiration, we are able to ignite a passion within you. And from there, be able to take off with you in a simple 3-2-1 manner. My name's Noel. I'll be here to support you right through for the entire hour. And of course, it's only made possible by having an amazing team with Cole, who's going to come on to show some amazing demos. And of course, Vic behind the scene, making sure that the YouTube live goes smoothly. Of course, Laureen has been helping us program manage the entire session right from the beginning. Now, Microsoft Hybrid User Group is a user group platform that we built a couple of years ago. although the membership doesn't look so exciting, but I believe we have some key people in there, and we'd love to have you by you clicking on the QR code and joining us on this. All right, in here we constantly and continuously share all the latest and greatest, and even insights into how the technology can help protect you. So that said, we also have a WhatsApp group called Security 101, which we would like you to be part of. And we also know that many of the social media platforms are also being targeted, like Twitter, for example, but not limited to that. Even some of the e-hailing platforms like Uber and so on are being attacked. So these areas of security are some of the key areas that we believe that you need to be aware of so that you can take the necessary precaution. So that said, just this morning, I saw one of my ex-colleagues share about this article on end-user password utopia. Now, passwordless is going to be possibly the latest and most important thing that many of us have to adopt, right? And most of you probably know that password has been around for the longest time. Then what are we saying about passwordless? That means you're cutting down the amount of passwords and using technology like Azure AD, MFA, conditional access, and so forth allows us to take down the amount of password scenarios so that most of the time you can use even technology like Hello, whereby it authenticates with your face and so forth. Now, most of you probably know that the traditional way of computing, right, in the data center perspective has been moving rapidly towards cloud. But many of us also know that cloud has also given us an opportunity to pivot into something called hybrid. So as we go along, we see many customers taking advantage of the ability to burst into cloud. And for those workloads are suitable, they persist in the cloud, meaning they are kept there, like those two workloads that you just saw pop up on my screen. But more importantly, beyond that, we also see customers taking advantage of that ability to transform. And this transformation includes bringing down some of those Azure PaaS services down to the on-prem environment. So today, we want to feature two specific scenarios for you. All right. If you see this particular diagram that we have created for you, this is on my screen what many organizations are doing. They run VMs on servers on their on-premise environment. So they have a combination of Windows, VDI, they have Windows Server, they also have Linux virtual machines. That's typically what many customers do. But increasingly, we are seeing customers take advantage of Azure. So on the left, you see Windows Admin Center, allowing these three nodes here to connect into Azure, into what we call that Azure hybrid. So that's the second scenario. Third scenario that we want to elaborate in this tech talk is actually where we have Azure PaaS services like Azure Kubernetes Service and Azure Virtual Desktop running side by side, if you want, with all those earlier virtual machines, including the ability to take advantage of the Azure hybrid. So all these are only possible if we have the ability to go into a highly virtualized, but yet high-performing, highly reliable solution that takes us away from the older, if you want, platform into the current platform. We believe many customers today are taking advantage of HCI. So from a Microsoft perspective, we see this HCI particularly exciting because we are able to take advantage of all the local drives of service, combining them together to be high-performing, powerful platform to take advantage of those PaaS services as illustrated right in the center of this slide, if you want. Of course, bubbling above that, we see all those other services like containers, cognitive services, data services, and of course, those virtual machines that we mentioned earlier, right? And to take it even further, in future sessions, we'll go through the Arc side of management from Azure in more depth. But even in this session, we will be featuring some aspect of that from an Azure Arc managing AKS perspective. So let's jump straight into how we can take this further. On-premise, we use Windows Admin Center. In Azure, we use the Azure portal to access the Azure Arc. And also, Windows Admin Center has recently been featured in there as well, giving us a seamless ability to manage from on-prem into Azure to take advantage of features that is even introduced through technology like Windows Subsystem for Linux. Now, without stealing the thunder from Ko's demos, I'm going to now invite Ko to join us to show very quickly how we can take advantage of Windows Subsystem for Linux from the on-prem perspective, right? And I've asked him to feature 2 specific scenarios, but for the interest of time, I believe we probably will only be able to talk about it from a Windows Server 2022 perspective. Over to you, Ko. Thank you.
Thanks. Let me share my screen. Yeah, can you see the screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Noel, for the invitation. So let's take a look on the Windows introduction and some demo that I'm going to do on the Windows Subsystem for Linux. Right. So the Windows Subsystem for Linux lets developer and IT pro run a Linux environment, right, including most command line tools, utilities, and application directly on Windows. Right. So back in May 2019, Microsoft announced WSL2, which is Windows Subsystem version 2, right, and shipped with Windows 10 version 2004. And 2 years later, right, Windows 11 have inherited the capabilities, right, with more newly added features, right. And this year, in June 2022, right, Windows Subsystem for Linux version 2 has made available via the update for Windows Server 2022, right? So this is a very exciting environment for developer and IT pro that we have a capability to actually run the Windows Subsystem version 2 natively in Windows Server 2022, right? So let me show you a demo on how I actually run the Windows Subsystem for Linux version 2 actually in Windows Server 2022, right? So this is my Windows Server environment, right? And as you can see here, I actually use the PowerShell to actually enable the Windows Subsystem for Linux. And from here, I can actually run the WSL version 2 directly. For example, I have a Ubuntu distribution that is currently installed and running. As you can see from the screen here, my default setting for the WSL is actually version 2. Right. Version 2 actually provide better compatibility and security for the subsystem to run within the Windows OS. Right. As you can see here, I even have the capability to actually turn on the S window for my Windows subsystem. Right. So how powerful and interesting is that not only that, I have the Linux shell to actually interact in between these 2 systems. I even can enable and turn on the X window interface for better usage experience. Right? So as you can see here, this is my Ubuntu running on Windows Subsystem version 2 on top of my Windows Server 2022. Right? So I think this is what I'm going to show. Right? And due to interest of time, I also share a lot of recording in our YouTube channel, as well as some of the information shared in our LinkedIn channel. All right, thank you, and over to you now.
Thank you, Ko. Thank you.
No problem.
Let me just quickly reshare my screen. Now, I hope that quick demo gives you an opportunity to see how Windows Subsystem for Linux works, right, seamlessly in Windows Server 2022. So the next bit that we wanted to get was to get Ko back again to look at Windows Server 2022 and its support for containers. So in this particular demo, we wanted to show how easy it is to set up a couple of containers so that you can use applications and databases just like as if you had them installed in your own system. So Ko, can I get you back for that? Thank you.
Yes, of course, thanks. All right, thank you, and glad to be back again. So in this demo, I will actually walk through on how we actually, for example, use the graphical tools like Windows Admin Center to actually connecting to the server. And from there, we are actually managing the container using the GUI interface. Right. So as you can see here, this is my lab environment where I have my Windows Admin Center connecting to Windows Server 2022. Right. From here, I actually have the container extension that is been enabled, and I can actually use it to actually manage the container that is actually deploying in my Windows Server environment. And not limited to that, I also want to share that the container extension also work for Azure's HCI OS. All right. From here, you can see that currently I have one container that is running, and I have multiple images, the container images that I downloaded from either from public Docker repository or Microsoft repository. Right? These are the core image that the developer, the IT pro, that actually use to customize their own container images and use it to actually for app containerization and also the publishing purpose. Right? Just a little bit of time. Let me fast forward a little bit. Right, as you can see here, I have different images that is downloaded for my usage purpose. Right, from here, you can have them in the different version, and you can use it according to the requirement, to the deployment requirement. Right. As you can see from here, not only I have Windows container, I also have Linux container like Ubuntu, right, and SUSE Linux, and so on. But as an illustration, I wanted to spin up a container. Right, I'm going to use the Windows Server 2022, the core version together with the IIS. Right, from here, I put the name for my container, and I specify the port and some parameter that I want to run for my container. Right, so simple, right? Instead of using the command line, we can also use the Windows Admin Center, the container extension, to actually interact with the Docker services that are running in the server, and we providing a GUI interface to actually spin up and manage the container directly from here. Right? As you can see here, my container is actually up and running. Right? And let's take a look on the container that is currently running, because we can actually manage the entire life cycle, the deployment life cycle, directly via this Windows Admin Center. So we can manage the container, right? We can manage the image, right? And so on. And we can also have a overview on how the container resource has been utilized. All right. It will take a little bit of time for loading. Let me fast forward a little bit. Yeah, you can see here, just now I have spin up a container called IND by using the Windows Server core with the IIS. So let's take a look, see how my container is running. Right. So it's so powerful and simple that with a GUI interface that you can actually interact with the container service and actually have the container up and running. And of course, you always can have the advanced mode or other the command line capability to actually manage it via the PowerShell. Right. So let's move forward. What about how? Just now I actually run the container with the container extension that is actually enabled in the Windows Admin Center. And what about if we have multiple container and we would like to use the orchestration services like AKS to actually manage our container, right? So this is some of the illustration on how I actually spin up a SQL Server container, right, using the AKS, which is the Azure Kubernetes Services, right? From here, we need to trigger the management and the orchestration capability on the AKS using the PowerShell command. And from here, you can see that my container is up and running, and I use the SQL Server Management Studio tools to actually interact with the SQL Server container that I actually spin up and orchestrate in my Azure Kubernetes services. All right. So how simple it is, the developer and the IT pro doesn't need to go through the life cycle on installing the virtual machine, installing the SQL Server, and as simple as to get it actually running by spin up a container. As you can see here, this is the SQL Server, right? And it's actually a Linux version and currently running on Ubuntu. Right? So I think this is how, and this is one of the very interesting method, a very convenient method for users, for developer, for IT pro to actually spin up the apps by using the containerization capability. All right. So I think this is where I wanted to illustrate it. Yeah. Thanks. And
now I
over to you, Lon.
understand why it's so important for us to understand the WSL
Yes.
version 2, because the WSL
Okay.
version 2 allows us to run Linux inside Windows Server 2022. And that is the
Exactly.
platform that allows us to launch the Linux containers, which is currently running
Yes.
SQL. Amazing.
Yes. How
Amazing.
powerful is how amazingly it is we can actually have two platforms running at the same time within our Windows platform.
Amazing. And then, of course, you had your earlier container, which is running IIS, which is a
Yes.
web server built into Windows Server. All right.
Yes.
So you had a Windows Server container and you have a Linux container side by side on the same system running different application. One, a web server, right, on the Windows Server container, and then you have the SQL Server running on the Linux container. Amazing.
Yeah. Yes. Amazing.
Cool. Thank you so much for that, Ko. That was a
no
very
problem.
interesting set of demos that you just showed. So to summarize, the containerization technology with Azure HCI is super duper simple, all right, and it's powerful, right, to say the least. But what is more important is all this technology is at your fingertips and is built into, all right, the Windows Server platform as well as Azure HCI platform. So that's why we wanted to show you this so that you not just be able to see it, but hopefully you are as excited as we are in terms of its capabilities. All right, so Ko also showed very quickly how easy it is. Just from a few lines of command in PowerShell, he's able to spin up the AKS, and the AKS was able to start the Linux container with SQL Server inside. So thank you so much for those couple of great demos. Now, the next bit that we wanted to jump into is Azure Virtual Desktop. Now, why this is so important is because VDI today is not just limited to remote desktop services whereby you spin up from a Windows Server environment. Increasingly, due to the pandemic, many customers have discovered that leveraging the cloud is the way to go, but they wanted that leverage to be brought on-premise. So that's where Microsoft started to make available AVD from Azure down into the on-prem environment. So Ko, can you take us through, all right, how we actually can do this? It sounds too good to be true.
Yes. Sure. Let me show you a demo recording on how I actually made this happen and how it can actually benefit our value customer and partner to actually to have this service deployed. Right. So Azure Virtual Desktop for HCI likes a customer to actually deploy the cloud managed Azure Virtual Desktop Station host to the on-premise Azure HCI infrastructure. And customer can also manage the session host from the Azure portal directly. So how powerful is that, this solution, right? So let me walk you through a scenario, right? How the user actually using these services, this capability to actually access the resources that is running on-premise on the customer data center, right? So as you can see here, this is my Azure Virtual Desktop web client, and their customer actually log into the data center environment in where the Azure HCI is running, and with the Azure Virtual Desktop is configured via the Azure portal, right? And this is the environment after the user will actually log in from the Azure portal, the AVD session, right? The web client. And from here, there's a lot of things that we can actually simulate and actually get benefit to the customer to actually access to this environment. For example, upon the access to the environment, the administrator can configure properly with all the departmental shared folder. Right, this is allowing the file collaboration between department. Right, for example, as an illustration here, I have a file called a sales summary report. Right, a dashboard that is created using Power BI, right? So you can imagine that the marketing department, right, is actually logged into VDI, the AVD station with this VDI technology, right? And they are actually doing information exchange, information sharing, right? Collaboration, right? So one of the department created a report, then others staff, the colleagues actually come in to open the report and have the interaction in the report and so on, right? So it's a very powerful platform that allows remote secure access into the environment where colleagues from different departments are actually doing collaboration with a departmental folder that is being shared. Right, so you can see here how powerful it is. The Power BI dashboard is currently running and sharing and having interaction between departments. And not limited to that, right? We can also deploy the in-house application. For example, the customer have a in-house accounting system called AutoCount, right? And they can also use leverage this platform to actually have the interaction and have their daily transaction via this platform. Right? From here, you can see that I actually demonstrate for the scenario where the account staff actually log in via the AVD and log into the in-house application that is published to them into their station. And they can actually log in doing their daily transaction, making some account changes, update the chart account, and so on. Right, so it's so powerful that I show you you can run Power BI for reporting purpose. You can run the in-house software, and so on. And not limited to that, you definitely can run the application like Microsoft Office. Like, for example, the management actually sharing the Excel dashboard to actually have an overview on the sales report and so on. Right? So this is how we actually utilize this platform and have the collaboration within all the departments and so on.
Amazing, Paul.
Yeah. And
Wow.
then the dashboard open for a while. Oh yeah, okay, it's up. All right.
Take your time.
So you
Take
can
your
see.
time. Take your time. We have plenty of time.
I'm bosses. I log in via the AVD and hey, come on, sales department, can you actually make ready the sales report for me? And the sales department just put the file into the share folder. Then the manager come in and open the share folder. Okay, good. Our sales seems to be not bad this month. Okay, and so on. You see, the interaction is very powerful by leveraging in this platform. Right? So this is what I would like to say, and the scenario that one of the scenario that is good by using this Azure Virtual Desktop. Right? Thanks, Noah.
Thank you, Cole. Thank you. So that gave us a glimpse, all right? I think it's a very quick but comprehensive glimpse on how Azure Virtual Desktop, which is essentially a VDI platform from Azure, is brought down on-premise. Now, some of you are probably wondering, is Cole really showing something on-premise? Right? The reality is today, the Microsoft technology has evolved at such an accelerated pace because of the pandemic more than anything else, that we are able to achieve this. Now, the next bit I wanted to quickly jump back into is it possible for us to do the same thing on-premise? Because sometimes customers feel that bringing Azure services on-premise is not yet that step that they want to make. So if I were to take three steps back, all right, is it possible for us to do that? So I wanted us to review very quickly what is something that customers can do, especially for those users working from home. Now, many of us know that because of the pandemic, we have a phenomenon of work from home, right? So built inside Windows Server 2022, right, we have the ability to leverage technology, right, like remote desktop services to achieve this. So simply users can access their apps from anywhere, right? Whether they are working from home or from outside the office, as like they are in the office. Because it's so easy to use and the applicants run on their servers and their data is kept in their servers, many organizations feel that it's a lot safer. Just like how Azure Virtual Desktop runs in the on-prem environment. And these services that I'm talking about are built inside Windows Server. So it's something that customers are familiar with and they are able to benefit from the easy access to applications and data and still maintain data security in their service. Of course, they gain flexibility and reliability for some of their most demanding needs, because sometimes certain applications are not suited to run in their own laptop, even if they are provided with a very powerful workstation. And that's something that we wanted to show you as part of the demo scenarios that we have captured for you. Now, of course, from an IT perspective, the central management and deployment of their business data and application continue to be very critical for them to move ahead. So from a simple architecture perspective, Microsoft RDS is composed of the following roles: RD Web Access, RD Gateway, RD Broker, Connection Broker, right? The RD Session Host, where the applications will run, all right? And of course, there's also the RD License Server that keeps tab of all the user connections and so forth, and making sure that they have enough licenses. And of course, the data that is stored will be stored in a file storage somewhere. Okay, so these make up the major components of the solution. And the good news is, even with Windows Server Standard Edition, customers are able to leverage those capabilities, especially for some of the smaller requirements, because sometimes customers don't need a lot, all right? And therefore, many a time they will ask, you know, with my limited budget, can I do it? So the simple answer to that, yes. A simple yes is more than enough. You can actually achieve all those capabilities of larger environments. In a similar token, AVD could easily be deployed for a few virtual desktops on-premise. And that's something that we've been testing and we've been trying out even in our own environment to give customers the confidence, all right? So if I were to take that from a licensing perspective, using a copy of Standard Edition, how can I actually quickly achieve this for customers who want to do this in a robo or edge scenario? So with Windows Server Standard Edition, customers is entitled to 2 Windows Server operating system environment. So what can you do with that? The first virtual machine, obviously, you could set up your domain controller, all right, including the file server role, and even to extend, deploy a database and even an ERP system on top of that. Because truly, Windows Server is a highly scalable scenario. It can use a lot of virtual CPU. In fact, it can go up to 240 virtual CPU in a single virtual machine, because many terabytes of memory if you need that. And in the second virtual machine, you can turn on all the different RDS roles that you require, which I've talked about. So that gives us the on-prem scenario. So if I were to extend COS scenarios, right, into an end-user environment, there could be an audit department, and the audit department's looking at it from a report viewing perspective, data analysis, and even accessing files for printing purposes and so on. And of course, the accounting department could have daily transactions and also needing to report, view their reports and even access documents and so on. Not forgetting the IT teams need to be able to patch the system. Like the recent last week, for example, there was a patch Tuesday and managing all these systems remotely. All right. So if I were to think of it from the perspective, can I then present GPUs? Just like what we would do with Azure Virtual Desktop, one of the other demos that we were hoping to feature, if time allowed, was to be able to present GPUs into the Azure Virtual Desktop. In this case, what we have done is we presented GPUs to the virtual desktop in the remote desktop scenario. And not limited to that, obviously, is we wanted to be able to show some real-world tools that many graphic designers and IT people use to support their organization. Example of that is, of course, Adobe Premiere and even Adobe Photoshop. So I'm not sure if you realize we actually have those demos running in each one of these. So let me click through so that I can get all the demos going, right? In each one of these screens, we actually have demos running, all right? So just to make sure that you are able to see them, all right? You see this one down the bottom. So the bottom one is where Photoshop, all right, is running, all right, in the virtual desktop. And in the second one, we have Adobe Premiere also running, right, in a virtualized environment. And the third, we have Adobe Premiere, but with a GPU. So you will soon realize that with the GPU, you get much better performance, all right, especially when it comes to rendering, graphics, and so forth, as well as if you didn't have a GPU, all right. So some customer says, you know what, must I have a GPU? It really depends on the requirement, all right. And we are able to support the GPU in many different ways. And that's also something that we talked about in the previous session, all right. So now that said, how can we imagine, or how can we visualize envision all these different services. So if I were to take us to the next bit, all right, we actually saw VDI on-premise with RDS, and we also saw Azure Virtual Desktop on-premise with the demo that Cole showed. Now, the interesting thing is some customers need to be a burst, all right, extensively, like what I showed earlier in the session. So that's where you can leverage the Azure Virtual Desktop in Azure as well. Now, some of you probably also heard, hey, you know what? Microsoft actually also has what we call a cloud PC with Windows 365. Right, for some of the smaller customers who don't have an on-prem environment, they need to quickly spin up a couple of virtual machines. They have that ability. So truly, we have a hybrid VDI that's extremely powerful. Now, management perspective, you saw Cole talked about Windows Admin Center. We will do more very shortly with Windows Admin Center. And of course, we also have the Arc and Windows Admin Center in Azure as well. So that gives us a hybrid management that's truly powerful. And we saw Cole talked about containers, right? Containers on-premise, all right, AKS on-premise, but truly the real scalability scenario from a cloud perspective lives in Azure. So that's where you can also do that in Azure to scale infinitely if you want. But not limited to that, although we don't have time to go through it this time around, we also want to illustrate that even from a disaster readiness perspective, we give you hybrid capabilities. Not limited to what you find on-premise, right? Like the Hyper-V replica, which is this illustration here. We have stretch cluster with this particular one, where it allows you to fail over from site 1 to site 2, and then site 2 back to site 1, as well as we have storage replica, replicating volumes. And of course, we also have a Windows Server backup. So these solutions form the on-premise disaster readiness strategy, if you want. In Azure, obviously, we have Azure Backup, we have Azure Site Recovery, and even Azure File Sync. So in future sessions, we will feature some of these exciting hybrid DR capability to show you that very easily and quickly, you can spin up these services so that it supports all your edge and robo requirements, right? Now, in the middle, we have a whole bunch of security capabilities, right? So many of you know that we have the multi-layer security, and of course, we have the secure core server, something that even Jeff Woozy talked about in previous sessions that we covered. But in Azure, we have a whole host of capabilities. Now, some of you might be wondering, is this Azure Arc here a mistake? Actually, it's not. Azure Arc comes with great capabilities to allow us to connect into Defender for Cloud. So it's a single point of management, single glass of management, if you want, to connect to multiple services. Not limited to Defender for Cloud, we can also talk to Azure Policy, Azure Monitor, Azure Update Management, and so forth. So it is that amazing portal for you to get through to that. Now, some organizations need a centralized console for their endpoint. So if the server is one of those endpoints, it can even talk to Microsoft Defender for endpoint, as well as even from a storage perspective. Now, all of these technology provides signals, and all these signals can end up in Microsoft Sentinel as being the Microsoft SIEM tool. Now, that gives us a comprehensive hybrid security capability that I believe can only come from a single organization like Microsoft. Now, from a patch management perspective, on the other hand, we have the on-premise patch capability with WSUS, Windows Server Update Services. We also have the ability to leverage something called Cluster Aware Update for patching of clusters. And of course, many customers in the past have used something like SCCM to provide the on-premise, but not limited to that. When we pivot patch management into cloud, we have Azure Update Management. The good thing with Azure Update Management is it also allows you to patch, not limited to Windows Server systems, but also Linux system. Just like how Cole showed you that we can work with Windows Server containers, we can work with Linux containers. Azure Update Management gives you the same flexibility and agility, right? So that takes us to the next bit. How do we manage all this end-to-end? So we have the Azure Arc, as mentioned, right, that lives in the Azure portal. And of course, we have the Windows Admin Center that lives on-premise. I remember earlier, I also mentioned that Windows Admin Center now is also available in Azure. Okay, so let's jump into each one of those one at a time. Now, Windows Admin Center, for the longest time, I'm sure many of you know it is free. It's also a browser-based tool. It's great for Microsoft Edge and also Chrome, although I highly recommend that you use Edge more than Chrome, right? Some of you who have actually attended our previous session will have seen some security capability of Edge that integrates with something called the Defender Smart Screen, and that gave it intelligence to block any malware from coming in through the browser. Now, the other area that I think is particularly powerful is Windows Admin Center's ability to manage from all the way at the beginning to the setup of the system, configuration of the system, and even beyond into the operations of the system. And as mentioned earlier, now it's also available in Azure. So I'm going to bring Cole back in to talk about the latest version of Windows Admin Center, right, and how he can use that to work with containers and AKS. Take your time, Cole. We got plenty of it. Go for it.
Sure. No problem. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Right. No, thanks now. Welcome back, everyone. So in this demo, I would like to illustrate and show you how we actually use the Windows Admin Center to actually manage the Azure Kubernetes service. And after that, how we leverage the hybrid capability that we can actually use the Azure Arc to actually manage the container lifecycle that is running on the AKS. Right. So let's start with it. Right. So this is my lab environment again. Right. We have so different scenario that's running, right? And this environment is actually running with the Azure Kubernetes service, right? And I'm usually using the Windows Admin Center to actually manage it, right? So as you can see here, from Windows Admin Center, we can actually manage the Azure Kubernetes service that is running on the cluster. And you can see here, it's actually connected to our Azure subscription, right? And the version that's running. And I also have my AKS cluster, right? On top here is the AKS, the Kubernetes service host service. And at the bottom here is actually the Kubernetes cluster that is running your the control plane as well as your worker nodes, right? So let's move it forward, right? After we have managed the Kubernetes service, how we can actually use the Windows Admin Center to manage and monitor the resource utilization for all the control plane as well as the worker node, right? So as simple as we leverage to the virtual machine extension in the cluster, right? From here, you can see that all the control plane as well as worker node is actually an individual virtual machine that is actually running on the cluster. Right. From here, we can actually manage and monitor the utilization for every individual virtual machine so that we know that any worker node or control plane is actually running out of memory or the CPU load is very high. And in the summary page, right, we also can have an overview of all the worker nodes and control plane utilization, right, all in one view, right. From here, we can even monitor the total CPU usage, total memory usage, as well as the IOPS stats for the AKS services that is currently running on the Azure Stack HCI. And speaking of the monitoring capability by onboarding the AKS cluster to Azure Arc, right, to Azure with Azure Arc, right? Thanks to Windows Admin Center, right, it's a management tools that Microsoft created to manage the Azure Stack HCI. Right. It also are the tools that will help us get started with AKS. And it's also the tools that connecting us to Azure Hybrid and link to Azure Arc. Right. So in my demo, I'm going to show you how AKS running on Azure Stack HCI will help you manage the Kubernetes resource such as namespace, workloads, services, storage, and configuration. In addition to that, with Azure Arc, this management capability has been made available in Azure Portal. Right? So let me walk you through the demo recording that I recorded. Right? So Azure offered a great control plane using the Azure Resource Management to manage all the Azure resources. Right. So by onboarding my Azure Kubernetes Services cluster to Azure with Azure Arc, I can use Azure Resource Manager to manage and monitor its security posture, resource utilization, configuration, and operation. Right. So in my case, I already onboarded my AKS cluster into Azure Arc using Windows Admin Center. Right. Let's take a look here in the cluster that I have here. Right. And you can see here the cluster actually become a native Azure resources, even though the cluster and all the data is stored on premise. You actually can get the object view in the Azure Resource Manager. You can see there's part of the Azure resources and it's a subscription. At the same time, you can also get some additional information, for example, the version number that you are running. Right. So first of all, I want to show you here is the security center, now rebrand as Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Right. So as Defender for Cloud continuously scan and monitor the configuration for the Azure Arc enabled machine to identify the potential security vulnerability and recommendation in Defender for Cloud. Right. You may also click on View Additional Recommendation to have a look on other rules, alerts, and recommendation available. Right? So how powerful it is, you can actually have a single pane of glass to view the security posture of our monitored environment. Right? In this case, it's my AKS services, right? AKS cluster. Right? So secondly, we take a look on policy menu, right? And click on the Azure policy, and let's take a look on the compliance stage of my AKS cluster. And you can see here, I got one compliance stage, which is not compatible, right? Not only one, I have two, right? So I definitely, with resources are not compliant with security assignment, I can click on individual of it, and now I can see, for example, the node, right? One of the node, right, are not compliant to field policy, and once I click on one of it, right, I will get to know more in detail and also the guidance, right, on how to improve it to be compliant, right? So let's move forward. Right. So let's take a look on log analytics menu. Right. From here, you can enable log analytics feature for the specific cluster, and that will send, for example, event logs data to the log analytics workspace, and then we can run query to actually go through and filter the event log for certain event. Right. As shown on the screen here. This is one of a very simple query where show all the logs for event, and you can browse through for checking purpose. And I can also go for performance data query template, for example. From here, for example, I wanted to search for container memory for specific of time. So this is the utilization result, and this is how we use the query tools to actually query the data. And the example that I show you here is actually I'm using the query template that provided by the log analytics workspace. All right. So speaking of performance data, what can I also do is I can eventually use the Azure Monitor, for example, to have a look on my cluster section for node utilization, for memory utilization, node count, right, and active pool count over period of time, and so on. Right? So what I like the most about the performance system insight is you are able to increase the time range, right, of monitoring. Right. In addition to that, I can also monitor the resource utilization for worker node. Right? And of course the controller, which is a control plane, and of course the resource utilization for the container. Right. It also gives you a graphical chart more to have a better understanding for the resources utilization over period of time. Right? So this is for this GUI interface is very useful for administrator to actually manage the environment. Right? last but not least, I wanted to show you the Kubernetes resources panel, which is currently in preview for Azure Kubernetes Service. So in this panel, I can have an overview of extension like namespace, which is the logical group for Kubernetes resources, such as port and deployment. Right? You can monitor the port and deployment that is currently running on premise, right? And for workloads, right, for development, port, replica, stat, and so on. Right? This is the object that we can actually manage via the Azure Arc capability, right? And services for AKS, load balancer, network translation detail, and so on. Right? You can also even manage the network controller here, right, for ingress and outgress services. Storage, is for persistent volume provisioning, and of course the configuration. But how powerful it is, you can actually view your AKS namespace or port configuration directly from Azure Portal. Right, this is to view the detailed configuration setting on individual namespace, for example. Right, what even better is I can deploy an application directly from Kubernetes resource panel, right, by accessing to a workload extension and click on the add button. Let me show you. So this is the workload extension. From here, I will click on add button, and from here, I will actually use the YAML file that is created, and I can actually paste into this panel and actually have the container that created via the Azure Portal. So how powerful it is, you actually trigger the container creation from the Azure Portal. However, the workloads, like the container, is actually spin up from the on-premise Azure Kubernetes services that is running on-premise. Right, so you can see here, I have spin up the sample voting app created by Microsoft, right? And from here, after it has spin up, you can see that the namespace is actually show up. The workload is show up in the panel, right? You can actually monitor it. And of course, if you go to the services panel, you can see that the Vault application is actually up and running with a load balancer being assigning a local IP address for me, right? So
Michael.
once we, yes?
Yeah, just to let you know that we have 10 minutes to the clock.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, it's 10 minutes. Right. So from here, the administrator will actually remote back to the on-premise environment and monitoring the resources. As you can see, we can actually use the Azure Portal to have entire containers deployment lifecycle. Right. So as you can see here, this is the app that is running on my Kubernetes services, and it's all managed by the Azure Arc on Azure Portal. But how powerful is it? Right. So I think that's all for me. And back to you, Noam.
Thank you, Ko. Thank you. I
Yep,
think
no problem.
Ko did an amazing set of demos to show how from Windows Admin Center we can pivot into Azure, all right, with Azure Arc. So from a powerful on-premise tool into Arc that gives us the ability to manage with a single pane of glass. And the good thing to all of that is it's a free tool, first and foremost, Azure Arc. But of course, as you turn on the features, like some of the ones that Ko talked about, like log analytics and so forth, those components require some amount of cost. And that's how, when we are packaging it later, I'll show you something that helps you do the cost management perspective and estimates, right? So through this portal, you're able to enable multiple sets of services, bringing Azure to an on-premise setting, right? And that's where he showed through Arc the ability to do that. Now, when Windows Admin Center 22.11 was made available recently, they provided powerful add-ons, as what I mentioned earlier as well, through Dell EMC with HP and Lenovo. So each one of them has updated their respective extensions, like the Dell Open Manage extension version 3, Dell PowerPass version 1.2, and of course with HP, they have the HP Server and Azure HCI Windows Admin Center extension version 1.6, Then, of course, there's also the HPE Azure HCI cluster deployment and update, Snap-in version 1.3. Not forgetting, Lenovo also updated their extension, taking them to xClarity Integrator version 4.2.3. So all of these, if you want, gives us a powerful combination of how customers can take advantage of Windows Server when they buy from Dell, EMC, HPE, or Lenovo, attaching that with software assurance, as what we have covered in the past, and combining that with a powerful server hardware solution, right? They are able to leverage multitudes of cloud solutions, all right? And some of that we have shown over the last couple of sessions, right? But not limited to that, if you want. We also saw how through Azure Arc, we were able to leverage many of those other services as well. Okay. So that said, all right, I wanted to quickly spend a couple of minutes on how we can take you from where the technology is so exciting to what you can do to plug in into all the different hardware platforms. So with that, I wanted to show you the Azure HCI catalog. It's just a simple website, but it's a powerful website whereby you can see those technology in action, all right, through our OEMs, all right. So if you come to that portal site, all right, just by typing Azure HCI catalog, it will take you through this link. And in here, under the catalog, you find all the brands of service that are available from our OEM, like Dell Technologies, Hewlett Packard Enterprise, and Lenovo. An important thing to note also is you can see these nodes per cluster. As mentioned back as far as May this year, when we first announced the one node, now, as you can see, there are multiple brands that supports the one node. Right, in our region, obviously, we have the Dell brand, we have the Dell Technology brand, we have the HPE brand, we also have the Lenovo brand. So all the common brands that we are familiar with supports the 1 to 4 nodes, and of course, all the way to 16 nodes. So the way they categorize it is merely to help people narrow down the smaller configuration very quickly from a switchless perspective all the way to the bigger configuration from 4 node onwards and even into the 16 node. Now, the other bit that is very important that of late is the GPU support. So that's where I believe this particular option is a powerful one for us to quickly understand what we can work with for GPUs supported scenarios. And of course, the storage part, using a combination of persistent memory as storage, even NVMe, SSD, and spindle drive. So this particular site is particularly important for us to get started. Not forgetting, we also have a sizer component, right? So we can go in here to look at the sizing of the different systems. We can look at integrated systems. We can look at validated nodes. And of course, the different types of CPU to go with that. And of course, the brands of service as well. So we have the HPE, we have the Dell, we have the Lenovo, and even beyond. Now, this particular tool gives us a good way to understand how sizing works down to the workloads that we want to put in. Now, we talked a little bit about VDI from a hybrid perspective. So in here, you can actually specify that VDI scenario that you need. Like in this example, I'm using 20 virtual desktops, right? And we got 4 virtual CPU, and the ratio of virtual to physical, I set it to 8. You can reduce that if your virtual what you call your virtualized desktop needs more power. Like say, for example, you need it for rendering, like what I was showing you with Adobe Premiere, Adobe Photoshop. You can bring that down to a ratio of 4 if you want, right? Meaning that every 4 virtual CPU maps to 1 physical core, all right, and so forth. So this particular tool gives us that capability. Now, the last bit I wanted to show you here is the network environment that you will build. This particular site gives you a very rich set of hardware that is currently supported, all right, tested and supported, but not limited to that. A lot of networking hardware may not be listed here, but they map to all the requirements, the mandatory IEEE standards and specification based on the different versions of Azure HCI that you might be working with. And of course, the latest being 22H2. So don't forget this powerful site that can help you prepare yourself much better. So in the last couple of minutes, all right, I just wanted to summarize what we have covered. Okay, let me just quickly break out of that, right, and take us through to a quick summary. Now, in this summary, I wanted us to quickly also review what we learned from that traditional to the hybrid. In the hybrid world, we believe in bursting, ability to elastically extend services, but some of that may need to persist, right? Persisting means leaving those burst scenarios in cloud because that's where we are able to scale best. But at the same time, we want to transform, right? We want to be able to leverage what is available in cloud today in the on-prem environment. So that said, that's why we decided that this particular session, we needed to cover the burst, persist, transform scenario. We needed to teach you and guide you on how simple the containerization technology is, leveraging something like Windows Subsystem for Linux containers. But not limited to that, we wanted to quickly also introduce Azure Kubernetes to you, and not forgetting that virtual desktop today is more powerful, more elastic and scalable than ever before, because we are able to bring the Azure version of virtual desktop called Azure Virtual Desktop into the on-prem environment. Last but not least, also talked about management. Hybrid management, I believe, is the way to go, right? Today, there's probably not one set of management approach that fits all requirements. So that pretty much takes us to the end of today's Tech Talk, all right? And we are top of the hour. And not forgetting that this particular session, we were able to cover the bit on Azure PaaS services in the on-prem environment on top of Azure ACI 22H2. So please drop your questions into the chat window. And of course, like any past sessions that we have done, we want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts, from my team, Cole, Vic, Lorraine, and yours truly. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.